Welcome to the second webinar in the World Languages Standards Update webinar series. Today we're talking about the updated proficiency outcome charts for the new standards. This is your NCDPI World Languages team, including myself. My name is Anne-Marie Gunter. I am the World Languages Consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. Glad to see you all here. I did want to go ahead and show you my video, but I am going to mute my video because that makes the recording easier to process and so forth at the end. All right, let's talk about what we're going to do today. First and foremost, on our agendas are welcome and introductions. We want to get to know everyone, get a little bit of background information that's relevant to our topic today, which is our updated proficiency outcome charts. We're going to specifically look at the recommendations from the review and revision phases for our standards and how we got to these new standards, and ultimately the proficiency outcomes document, which you see here. We're going to look at the organization of that proficiency outcomes document. We are currently on draft 5, so this is not a finalized document yet, but it will be by the end of January, so just a few months away. And then we're also going to get a preview of the programs in that proficiency outcomes document, or POD, if you want to use that acronym. At the end, we'll talk about some resources that you can access for our new standards and do a little bit of wrap up. So that's our plan for today. Let's begin with our welcome and introductions. I introduced myself, and you know that I'm headquartered in Raleigh, obviously, but I want to find out where you're from. So I'm going to open up our poll question, which is simply, where is your district, charter school, or organization located in North Carolina, based on the map you see on the screen. When I do that, you should be able to access the poll questions in your space, usually on the bottom right of your screen, but it kind of depends on which screen or web browser you logged in with today. I'm going to go ahead and open that poll so you can respond, and just go ahead and click the answer that's right for you about where your district, charter school, or organization is located in North Carolina. Got about 10 seconds left. Go ahead and click your answer. All right. All right, you should be able to go ahead and see the results. We have people from kind of all over the state right now. I think somebody from every region. Some of you found out as well that we have people who serve multiple regions, maybe through something like North Carolina Virtual Public School, NCVPS, or they just have a regional kind of position that they do that. We also got some others, and some folks who didn't get a chance to answer. So don't worry, you'll get another chance at a poll here. All right, next up is, and this kind of has to do with what we're going to talk about today with the proficiency outcomes document. Which types of courses do you teach and or supervise? And this one you can check all that apply, so it's not just one. You'll actually have a minute and a half on this. Take a look. We look at grade spans. We look at different types of programs within the standards. And then you may have something else. If you're not sure what some of these things are, just do your best in answering this question, because we're going to talk about all of these today in our broadcast. All right, I'm going to open that poll so that you can respond. This is check all that apply. You've got about a minute and a half to make your selection. About 40 seconds left. If we get done early, of course, we can always close the poll and look at the results when they're ready. All right, 10 seconds left. Almost done. All right, great. Thank you for sharing. I'm going to go ahead and share those poll results with you, so you should see that come up. We have, again, at least one person who checked every one here on the list. We've got quite a few, it looks like high school teachers, and then a variety of languages with classical, DLI, heritage languages, and various modern language programs as well. Plus, our grades bands K-8 are represented. So thank you for that. I appreciate you sharing that today, and that'll help guide our discussion and activities as we go forward. Also, before we begin, I want to make sure you truly know each other, and I've also used the chat to do an activity. So I like to do waterfall in the chat, which is where we type our answers to a questions, but in a single message in the chat box, but we don't click send until I say, let's watch the waterfall. You may have heard this as flood the chat as well, but I prefer waterfall in the chat. So let's do our introductions. Please type in your name, first and last, the language or languages you teach and or supervise, and the organization that you're from. What's the name of your district, your charter school, your community college, your university, whatever it is you're at. But be careful, don't send it yet. Just type it as a single message, your answers to all three of those questions that are on that bulleted list. All right, put that in a single message and get ready to send it when I say, but I haven't said yet. So take a moment, prepare your response. I see some folks are getting used to how the chat works in WebEx. All right, please wait. Don't send yet. Don't send yet. Just do a single response with your name, the language or languages you teach or supervise, and your organization. But don't send yet. All right, let's watch the waterfall. What have you got? Please take a look as all of these are coming up on your screen. Hopefully, you see some colleagues that you already know. Maybe they teach in the same school or district as you or the same region. Maybe you've met them at conferences or other meetings, maybe even other webinars like this. Let's see who's here. We're watching the waterfall in the chat. All right, great. Look, we've got a variety of folks from all over the state, just like we saw on the map poll question. A lot of folks who say they're Spanish teachers, but we've got some Japanese, some French. I know we had some Latin teachers before. We've got Arabic and Chinese. All right, great. Oh, we've got a whole variety. ASL, German, Latin, even some DLI programs with Spanish. Great. Thank you so much for sharing. And we are going to be using the chat for several activities, so keep that handy and be ready to respond as we go through our information today. Well, that's our introductions. So let's go ahead and roll into our content. We are looking at our updated proficiency outcome charts today. The first thing we're going to talk about the recommendations from the review and revision phases, which I'm sure almost all of you actually helped with. When we were in the review phase in 2022-2023, you may remember that we did a number of things to get feedback on our current standards. We had surveys that went out for individuals to fill out and for groups to fill out. We had focus groups that we did virtually so that everyone could participate from across the state. We did interviews. We also compiled research on the latest information we had about K-12 world language education. We looked at, what are our policies and legislation that guide our work here in North Carolina? What national resources do we have, like national standards for world languages in a general sense, but also for particular programs like ASL or classical languages. And so we put all of that together and we gave it to the Data Review Committee, or DRC. You see them kind of pictured on the right. This was a group that was chosen by application who wanted to do this work, and they wanted to synthesize all of that information and then make recommendations about what our new standards should look like. Today we're going to talk about just what the recommendations were for those proficiency outcome charts and what they shared with us. So the first thing they said that was most critical about the proficiency outcomes was that we need to increase the rigor for those minimum expectations in the proficiency charts for student outcomes. Because remember, those proficiency outcomes are just minimums. That's where we expect students to be by the end of a course or a program that they're learning in, but they're just minimums. So locally, you may have higher expectations, but from the state perspective of the standards, we want those minimum expectations for student outcomes. The feedback also said we need to redefine the language types. So some of you may be familiar with the language types we have in our current standards. We're going to talk about that. And so the feedback said those aren't working as well as we thought they would. Let's redefine those and try a different way to think about different types of languages and how that impacts student outcomes and proficiency. The feedback also said to condense the K-8 sequences. They said we have way too many K-8 courses and course codes that go with them, and we need to condense those and make them more compact and more reflective of the kinds of programs we have K-8. And finally, they suggested we do something about supporting access to language study, making sure that more students get to take more languages in different ways, in different programs, and at different ages. World Languages is what we call multiple entry points. You can start studying a language anytime in your K-12 academic career, and it usually depends on what your local school is offering, whether that starts in the elementary, the middle school, or the high school. And so they said, basically the feedback said, make sure we put something in the proficiency outcomes documents and expectations that supports access to language study across the board. So those were the recommendations from the DRC that were then shared publicly at our State Board of Education meeting in June of 2023. And we were officially approved to begin the revision phase. During the revision phase in 2023-2024, last school year, we had a World Languages Standards Writing Team, or SWT. They took all those recommendations from the DRC and they revised our standards, our objectives, and those proficiency outcome charts that we're going to talk about today. And so you see their logo there. They were looking very carefully at that ACTFL inverted pyramid of proficiency that you see pictured. I'm sure you're very familiar with that, of course. We use that in a lot of our materials because this is a national resource that gives us a lot of tools to work with when we think about proficiency for our K-12 learners. So the first recommendation, as we said, was increase the rigor for those minimum expectations in the proficiency charts for student outcomes. That was first and foremost in the feedback. So the standards writing team added a proficiency level. So there are now 9 proficiency levels. In our current standard, there are only 8. We go novice low to advanced mid in our current standards, but now we go novice low through advanced high. So 9 levels of proficiency that we can look to have objectives in as well as outcomes with. Notice on that inverted pyramid, of course, you start at novice low at the bottom. That's the beginning levels of languages. And then as you go up towards advanced high, in this case for our K-12 standards, you see that it gets wider and wider, and that's because language becomes more complex. And actually, then it also takes more time to go from one level to the next as you learn. Another thing the standards writing team was that they wanted to raise those minimum expectations in the proficiency charts. And when they did that, it impacted student outcomes across all programs, but especially at the novice and intermediate levels. Because like I just said, when you're learning a language and you start at novice low, those beginning levels, you kind of go quickly through novice low, mid, and even high And so what we have in our current standards, they said wasn't challenging enough. And so when they increased the rigor for those expectations, that impacted all student outcomes for all programs. But again, like I said, especially at the novice and sort of the beginning intermediate levels, like intermediate low. This also raised our sealed by literacy minimum to intermediate mid. It had been intermediate low since we got our sealed by literacy, the Global Languages Endorsement, or GLE, in 2015. But this meant we were going to raise our minimum expectation to intermediate mid for our sealed by literacy. So those were how the standards writing team implemented the recommendation to increase the rigor for minimum expectations and the proficiency charts for student outcomes. Another recommendation the standards writing team worked on was redefining the language types, particularly for heritage and modern language programs. Now, specifically, in our 2010 Standard Course of Study, or SCOS for world languages, we had language types defined as alphabetic languages, logographic languages, and visual languages. Alphabetic covered any language that uses an alphabet of any kind. So, French, Spanish, German, as I saw some of you put in the chat, all fall under alphabetic languages, as does Arabic, and some other languages that, though they have an alphabet, it's not an alphabet necessarily that our students are very familiar with, so it takes them a little bit more time. So there was some pushback on the alphabetic and how that was grouped. For logographic languages, we have languages like Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. And again, that's where you've got a symbol that relates to meaning rather than a letter or something that relates to sound in a language with alphabetic languages. And then, of course, we had visual languages, which is American Sign Language, or ASL. Now, in both sets of standards, the old one from 2010 as well as the new one in 2024, classical languages are their own group. So they don't get categorized as alphabetic, logographic, or visual, but classical languages are, for example, Latin, Ancient Greek, and Sanskrit. So in our 2024 Standard Course of Study for World Languages, the standards writing team looked at a number of different options about how to define language types and determined that the Foreign Service Institute, or FSI, groupings would be the most effective for what we wanted to do in adjusting those proficiency outcomes based on the feedback. The FSI, by the way, is the group that works with our diplomatic and military learners who are using languages all over the world on behalf of our country and our work. But they also have a very clear guide about, for example, how many hours of instruction is tied to different levels of proficiency outcomes. That's done, of course, for adult learners, but we can still learn from the FSI groupings for languages. And here's what they look like. Category 1 and 2 languages, because they call them Category 1, Category 2, Category 3, and Category 4. Category 1 and 2 languages were grouped together, and they're the languages you see on the screen. So these are some of, as you might guess, the alphabetic languages, but not all. And so you see a variety that we have. And then Category 3 and 4, which are languages that take a little bit more time and are considered to be a different level of difficulty from Category 1 and 2, those Category 3 and 4 languages just came up on the screen too. So now you see some of our alphabetic languages like Arabic, for example, categorized with languages like Chinese. And so this, they thought, as a standards writing team, was a better way to think about how the languages could be grouped when we looked at things like common proficiency outcome expectations on the charts for K-12 language learning. I will also indicate American Sign Language, or ASL, on there kind of gets a special place because it is technically a Category 3 language, but also sometimes the standards writing team, in looking at proficiency outcomes, decided to create proficiency charts specifically for ASL and just refer to it as a visual language like we do in our current standards. And that was a decision they made based on some of the needs of our ASL programs. And by the way, ASL is the fastest growing language in the state right now. So we get a lot of different programs using ASL and teaching ASL. And so we looked at that in different ways. I will tell you, we're not the only state to use the FSI groupings for our languages. States like Ohio use that in their standards as well, and several others. So this is a fairly common way to think about how to group languages and think about proficiency outcomes, whether you're working with adults or K-12 learners. Another recommendation that Standards Writing Team tackled was condensing the K-8 sequences. And this is where we had a situation where, for example, in the 2010 Standard Course of Study for World Languages, we have 11 different courses for K-8. And these are not our dual language immersion or DLI courses. These are actually K-8 sequences where it's a modern language, so the language is being taught as a separate subject. Because what we have is 7 elementary course codes and 4 middle school courses that get their own course code. And part of that had to do with when we did the analysis of student work or ASW process, but also part of it has to do with how do we think about students taking language at the K-8 level, either K-5 or 6-8, and how they're building proficiency over time. In both sets of standards, of course, for K-8, you also have exploratory options. Exploratory is when you have a class for language that's either less than 90 minutes per week of instruction, because you have to have at least 90 minutes a week of instruction in order to build proficiency at that age group. Or it might be a class that's offered with multiple languages or part of a wheel where you're, for example, having middle school students think about which language programs they want to take when they get into high school or high school credit classes. So both sets of standards still have the exploratory as an option, but we need to condense the rest of the K-8 sequence. So the Standards Writing Team looked at that very carefully and kind of looked at what other areas do and other states do. And they decided that in our 2024 Standard Course of Study for World Languages, we would drill that down to 6 courses. We'd have 3 elementary courses, or what we call foreign language in elementary school, like FLES courses, again, meeting 90 minutes a week per week or more for instruction. And we would have 3 middle school courses. And so the way they structured those was just what you see coming up on the screen. There's a beginning, and that's for FLES or elementary programs in their first 2 years. There's a continuing, and there's an extending. Notice that we're going to have similar course codes, so we're getting fewer course codes, but we can reuse them. So for beginning, there's a course code that could be used for, like I said, elementary for the first 2 years of a program, wherever that starts, whether it's kindergarten or second grade or wherever they're starting language study, or for the middle school for 1 year, like their first year. Because when we're thinking about students learning language, obviously, our middle school students come to us as language learners with more skills to transfer. They already know how to read and write, for example, in another language besides the one they're learning. So they can transfer those skills more quickly than a younger student who's still working with that in their first language, which is probably English. And then as we go on, we have continuing, and that's for the next 2 years, if you will, of elementary study or FLES study, or the second year of middle school study. And finally, the extending. So again, FLES for 5 to 6 years, depending on if you maybe start in kindergarten all the way through 5th grade, or the middle school for the 3rd year. And these are specifically courses that do not get high school credit for middle school. We're going to talk about high school credit courses separately. So this is how the Standards Writing Team solved the issue that was brought up about condensing our K-8 sequences in world languages. And finally, there was a lot of feedback in the surveys especially, and even in the focus groups, about supporting access to language study and making sure that, for example, students have the opportunity for an articulated and sequenced series of courses, K-12. How do we set that up so that that's a possibility? We also wanted to have language study that builds proficiency in a language. And so one of the things that came through in surveys was, you know, if you're going to have an elementary or middle school program, just exploratory really isn't helpful in the long run. So if you could be in a series or a sequence that builds proficiency in language, that's what's most desirable. And also supporting access to language study that culminates in something for the student, maybe recognitions like the Seal of Biliteracy, maybe paths to advanced coursework such as AP, Advanced Placement, or IB, International Baccalaureate, and then opportunities for students to be competitive in post-secondary pursuits like college admissions, using the language in their career or the workforce, or even using the language in their military work if they decide to go that route. You'll notice, by the way, when we talk about supporting access to language study, I did arrange this by A, B, and C, articulated in sequence, builds proficiency, and culminates in something for the student. So think about that in relation to your own programs and how you're making that happen in your schools. So let's stop there. Let's think about these recommended changes. Once again, we're going to do waterfall in the chat. And what I want you to do is type your answers to the following questions in a single message again in the chat box. You can start with the letter of your response, and I actually covered up all the responses because I want to remind everybody, you're going to type this as a single message in the chat box, but you're not going to send it until I say, let's watch the waterfall. So the first question is, which recommended change is most interesting to you? And so I've got them there by A, B, C, and D, or there's E. Maybe there's something else that you recognize there that you want to think about. So once you put that letter for your response to number 1, then please type out your reason why. Why is that change most interesting to you? Is it the one that will impact you the most? Is it one that you weren't expecting? Is it one that you helped bring about based on your feedback on surveys or focus groups? Could be anything. All right, let's pause a moment. Go ahead and type your answers to those 2 questions in a single message in the chat box, but don't hit send yet. Please wait, don't hit send. We'll pause while everyone does that. Be thinking about these 2 questions, but don't hit send yet. All right, I hope everyone's got their message in a single chat. Let's watch the waterfall. What did people decide? All right. I see people with answers all over the board, A, B, C, and D. Some are saying they just thought that was sort of an interesting change that happened. Some said it'll make it easier for that age group of students, maybe condensing things like the course codes for K-8. Some can see that established sequence will help improve proficiency building for our students. Some also like the idea of increasing rigor, that that's going to be a real help to what we do in the classroom. And some like the idea of students being competitive. Great. Well, thank you for sharing that. Keep thinking about these changes because, like I said, we're focusing on the changes for this proficiency outcomes document. It's interesting because now our proficiency outcomes document is actually separate from our standards. Those of you familiar with our current standards know that it is tied up in the same document. And when they gave us the opportunity to separate it out as a support tool, that actually gave us an advantage because, as you know, the standards only get updated every 5 to 7 years, and sometimes it's longer than that, as it has been for us in several other subject areas. But if we need changes to a support document, we can actually make those at any time that we feel is right. So we don't have to wait for standards review and revision process in the future if we need to update things like our proficiency outcomes document and those charts that we rely on to write our local curriculum that's standards based. All right. Thank you again to everyone who shared. It looks like a lot of great answers in the chat. Well, let's go ahead and look at the organization of the proficiency outcomes document, or POD as we keep calling it, and really think about how that's structured and how we can use that information. So first and foremost, I want to remind you again, just like I did at the beginning, this is draft 5. You probably remember seeing draft 3, which is what we were using when we took draft 3 of the standards document to the State Board of Education for approval, and that was in June and July of this year, this past summer in 2024. However, what they said was, hold on to that, and we are going to form a standards resources team, an SRT, and they can continue to look at the proficiency outcomes document and finalize it, again, based on feedback and the things that we're trying to build into the proficiency outcomes document that will be most helpful for teachers. So here's our table of contents currently. On page 1, there's an overview and summaries of the different proficiency levels, those 9 proficiency levels that we've got. And then each of our 3 programs has its own space in the proficiency outcomes document. So classical language programs are on pages 2 to 4, dual and heritage language programs are on pages 5 to 7, and modern language programs are on pages 8 to 13. And yes, it does have a lucky 13 pages right now as a proficiency outcomes document. Notice that each program section has an asterisk there because, again, we have 3 different K-12 programs in our standards. Each of those program sections has a description of the program similar to what was in the current standards document. It has K-8 program details with proficiency outcomes charts to follow, and then it has high school credit course levels information, again with the proficiency outcome charts that go with them. So that's the basic structure. You see it pictured, that proficiency outcomes document on the side there. And so the next few slides I have for us to look at are really just a careful look at this structure. And then we're going to continue on and you'll have a chance to actually access the proficiency outcomes document yourself. So let's take a look at draft 5 and see where we're at. One of the things that we kept hearing is that it would be nice for teachers to have a quick reference of our proficiency levels in the state standards. And we go through novice low through advanced high, as you can see here. And we base that on an inverted pyramid. And again, we have, color coding based on the inverted pyramid. And so novice levels are in blue, intermediate levels are in green, and advanced levels are in an orange color, as you can see there. So as we're looking at that, know that those summaries of each proficiency level were drawn directly from the objectives that were written by the standards writing team and sent out as drafts to get additional feedback on them and to finalize them. And so what we have here is just those quick summaries. Notice each has 3 bullets. So what I want you to do is look at this screen, and we're going to do a little activity called noticing notes. I want you to choose a row or a column to read. So a row would be, let's say, all of the advanced levels across that row, or all the intermediate levels. Or a column, maybe you want to look at all the low, advanced, intermediate, and novice low. So either a row or a column to read, and maybe you want to choose the one that you're most familiar with based on what you teach or where your students are at, or maybe you have some other reason for choosing that, but just choose one row or one column to read. As you're doing that, jot down 2 to 3 things you notice about the proficiency summaries that draw your attention specifically. And be ready to share that in the chat when I ask. So I'm going to pause for a moment. I'm going to let you choose your row or your column. Jot down 2 or 3 things that you noticed. And then we're going to talk about that. So I'll pause for a moment. I'm also checking behind the scenes to see if we have any questions or technical issues. All right, let's find out what you saw. What did you notice? So in the chat, just indicate the row or column that you read and put a note. What did you notice? What came to your attention about that? See, we have a couple folks who've chosen the intermediate row already that they've indicated, but what did you find? All right, this looks great. Some people are noticing that like in the novice level, you go from memorization into more complex things, low to mid. Some notice how things got more advanced across a row. Some notice the verbs that start out. What are the students doing? What are the verbs we're using? And the verbs are important because you may recall that one of the pieces of feedback we got was that we did not want to use revised Bloom's taxonomy verbs anymore in our standards. That's what we use in our current standards, and that has to do with a lot of things that were happening at the time we wrote our current standards. But the feedback from the field said, no, we need to use the terminology and the verbs associated with the necessitable, actful, can-do statements to talk about language learning. So I noticed you're noticing the verbs. People are noticing that gradually students produce more language. That's good. There's an emphasis on authentic resources, definitely. People are talking about authentic texts. And of course, authentic texts are anything that's written or designed for members of that group that uses the language. And so we want to use authentic text, not excerpts and not things that have been, you know, broken down somehow to be more simple. We want them to actually be using authentic text, but that can be anything. That could be an actual text, like an article or a book or a novel, but it could be things like newspaper headlines or a video or some kind of audio clip. It could be infographics that have language on them. There's a lot of things it could be. I see people celebrating that we're not tied to RBT or revised Bloom's taxonomy anymore. No, we are not. We are free of that. I see people noticing, again, the types of language students are going to produce. Like, for example, in advanced, we talk about paragraphs. People are also commenting on things like students using language simple sentences. They're noticing that increased rigor. That's good because that was the goal all along, that you said we needed more rigor in our standards and our proficiency outcomes. And we see people also looking at a row like in novice, that students use questions from simple questions to questions and sentences, and finally they use original questions. So creativity is used by learners. They have to come up with it, definitely. So there's a lot to notice there. So anyhow, this summary of proficiency levels we kind of have for our current standards. It was called learning trajectories in our current standards, and it was actually in our crosswalk document. Not sure why we put it there, but that's where it was. So the standards resources team felt pretty strongly that we needed this information, these summaries like this, front and center. So they're on page 1 of our proficiency outcomes document so that teachers can get a look at these. And then as they look in those proficiency charts, and again, that use the color coding that you see here, it's probably simpler for them to then connect that with what language the students need to be producing. And then they can go to their list of objectives for each of the standards that we have within our strands and see what are the details of that. These are just summaries that we have here on that page 1. All right, let's move ahead and see what's next. So here we are. We've got our new proficiency outcomes document. It's not finalized yet, as I said, because it is in draft 5. We were hoping that draft 4 would be the final one, but we are now to draft 5. But we will finalize it by the end of January, so we'll have it ready for like our regional workshops, as I said. But let's go ahead and do a preview of the programs in our proficiency outcomes document and really look at those charts and see what's there in this support tool for our standards. And as we go through this, I'm going to ask you to do what I call take and tell. We've all done show and tell, or at least I hope we have. But this is more take and tell, because as we go through this preview, I want you to find one page or a description or a chart or some bit of information that you want to take from today's broadcast and then tell someone else about it. So take and tell. Let's watch what comes up. And I am going to go ahead also and put a link to our draft 5, the proficiency outcomes document, in the chat. So if you want to reference that as we go through, but please don't get distracted scrolling through it because we are going to talk through it on the screen. One moment while I put that in the chat. All right, there it is. So you can click on that and that will take you to a PDF version of draft 5 so that you can look at that and have it kind of for reference when you're thinking about your take and tell activity. I'll pause just a moment to make sure you can get that up on a screen the way you need to. All right, let's roll forward. Well, we go in alphabetical order with our program. So classical language programs comes up first. It's on pages 2 to 4. In every section, like I told you, we have a program description. And so this is the one for classical language programs. Some of this probably looks familiar because what we have in our current standards where we describe classical language programs was pulled over. However, it was updated by the standards writing team, particularly our members who were experienced classical classicists or classical language teachers, because they said, you know, we want to make a clear statement about what a classical language is. And so you see there that it says it's a language like Latin, Sanskrit, and ancient Greek, that's no longer a native or first language for any population in the world. It was at one time, but not anymore. And so then it talks about how the language is accessible, what it's used in, as particularly in understanding other disciplines, and then what the focus is. Because in classical language programs, often there's a great focus on reading skills, as well as writing, reciting, and translating. We are starting to see some Latin programs have a conversation or a spoken component, but that is a local decision. And so we designed the standards, just like our current ones, the new standards would support spoken Latin or conversational Latin if a teacher wanted to implement that in their program, but it is only an option. So the support is there if you want it, but it's not required. So you've got your program description at the beginning. And then we go into K-8 programs. And so here we have the K-8 program details. And again, with proficiency outcomes charts, we do actually have K-8 Latin programs. We started showing us kindergarten with Latin in some places. And so here you see a description of K-8 programs in general. Like we mentioned, the foreign language in the elementary school are FLES programs as well as middle school courses. And then what research shows as far as, you know, needing a minimum of 90 minutes per week of instruction in that language in order to build proficiency. And so then it contrasts that with, for example, FLEX or foreign language exploratory programs, which fall below that or maybe are used for other purposes or to introduce multiple languages that might include, in this case, a classical language like Latin. So there's some K-8 program details with the proficiency outcomes chart. And then what you see coming up on the screen or on the document if you're looking through it is, in fact, the K-8 classical languages chart. Notice that we have each of our standards at the top now. That's a change because in our current standards, we actually put the standards on the left-hand side of the chart. Now we put them at the top. And now we specify our first standard, interpretive communication, obviously is reading as well as listening and viewing. Standard number 2 is interpersonal with speaking and writing. And standard number 3 is presentation with speaking and writing, but in a more formal sense. So speaking that's been practiced or rehearsed, writing that's been drafted and revised. Take a look at this for a moment. Like we said on the left-hand side, you have still the exploratory option, but since that doesn't build proficiency, all we have is a note about you would choose as a teacher from the novice level objectives for those kinds of exploratory offerings, right? But for beginning, continuing, and extending, you see that we have outcomes for these different skill areas. And again, beginning is either FLES for the first 2 years or middle school for the first year, whenever you start that as far as a multiple entry point. Notice that we have the different outcomes and think about what those proficiency summaries said about things like novice mid, novice high, and intermediate low. As we noted in classical language programs, there's quite a bit of focus on reading as well as writing. But you notice in the middle, when we talk about listening and viewing skills or speaking and writing or any kind of speaking at all, that's in gray because, again, that's been included for our classical language programs that choose to have an oral component of some kind, either interpretive or a speaking component with interpersonal or presentational. But because it's optional, it's presented slightly differently on the chart so that we send, hopefully, a clear message to our classical language programs about what's there for them and what they can choose to implement in their program or not. So that's our K-8 chart for classical language programs. As we go on, of course, we have the chart for high school credit course levels. And in North Carolina, students can take high school credit courses once they go into middle school, so starting in 6th grade if they would like. In classical language programs, we have levels 1 through 6 for high school credit. And you see at the top there, there's a little bit of a description of what those look like, how they articulate to advanced coursework like AP and IB that we mentioned before, how they fit in with things like meeting the world language requirement for the seal of iliteracy, and that kind of thing. And then you see again the proficiency outcome charts. Notice that classical languages is one of those that at level 6 actually gets to advanced, mid, or high levels of proficiency as their outcomes for reading. And so that's why it's important to have that 9th level of proficiency for programs like that that are quite advanced. Again, we have the optional skills in the middle, depending on what a Latin teacher or classical language teacher decides to implement in their program. Don't forget that our level 3 or higher courses in world languages are always what we call inherently honors. So that's why on the left-hand side, when we list the courses out, it says level 3 honors, level 4 honors, etc. Those are only available in the honors level. New this year, and with this set of standards, is a different option. Notice that level 1 and 2 have a little asterisk next to them, and there's a little note at the bottom about that. So I've blown that up so you can see it maybe a little bit better. For the first time, we are going to look at level 1 and 2 courses, which are always offered as standard levels. So standard is for levels 1 and 2, and then inherently honors for levels 3 and higher. But now we're going to have the opportunity to consider offering levels 1 and 2 as standard, and those may also be available as honors offerings pending final approval from leadership regarding course codes and how we structure honors courses or honors offerings versus standard offerings. So that is something brand new in our proficiency outcomes document. This is tied to the idea of supporting access to language programs for all students and helping make our students competitive in college admissions and the workforce and so forth with their language skills, just like we talked about before in the recommendations that the standards writing team implemented. All right, so that's classical language programs in the proficiency outcomes document. We also have dual and heritage language programs on pages 5 through 7. And once again, you have a description. So dual and heritage language programs is broken into DLI. And so you see the description of elementary DLI programs and then secondary DLI programs, which also to some degree includes heritage language courses, depending on the program and how they structure it. Then you see the K-12 program details with proficiency outcomes charts done by grade span, similar to what they are in our current standards. However, there's been a big shift here because now instead of breaking the languages into 2 different groups for the types of languages and having different outcomes, it was the decision of our standards writing team based on the feedback and so forth that they had to go ahead and focus on all languages having the same proficiency outcome. Remember, these are just minimums. So by the end of 2nd grade, by the end of 5th grade, by the end of 8th grade, and so on and so forth, right? This is where students would need to be regardless of the language that they are learning in their DLI program. And right now, North Carolina has 8 different languages that we do DLI in. You also see an asterisk there with grades K to 2 and grades 3 to 5, and that is because when the standards resources team was looking at this situation, they said, well, look, even though the outcomes for DLI programs are done by grade span, we want to make sure there's some guidance on those proficiency outcomes by grade level. And so that guidance will be in what are called our course navigators. Course navigators are the new version of the COCOs, the clarifying objectives by course outcomes documents that you may be familiar with for curriculum writing that's standards based. They're now going to be called course navigators with our new set of standards. We no longer have clarifying objectives, so we couldn't use that anymore. So course navigators is what you're going to see. So there'll be some additional guidance by grade level. So for kindergarten, for 1st grade, for 2nd grade, that encompasses that grades K to 2 outcomes that you see on the chart. Also, in dual and heritage languages, we have heritage language levels 1 and 2 courses. And again, we have a description of that, what that looks like, how that's different from modern language courses, the fact that heritage language courses are usually more language arts courses rather than language acquisition courses, and then how they're used in practice and in thinking about them. How are heritage levels 1 and 2 used in the sequence that a school or district might offer? And so again, we've got those program details and we've got the proficiency outcomes charts that go with them. So as we go look at those, here you see the outcomes charts for heritage courses for category 1 and 2 languages at the top, and for category 3 and 4 languages there at the bottom of the screen, right? Notice that when you do a sequence like heritage levels 1 and 2, after that, students are usually ready for either level 3 honors course in modern language or level 4 honors, or maybe even AP or IB, some of those advanced courses, kind of depending on the student and how quickly they can build their proficiency, particularly in literacy skills, which is the focus of heritage language programs. Like I said, language arts courses rather than language acquisition courses, because you're working with native speakers of the language, or that's their home or heritage language. And you may also be working with secondary level DLI students as well. Notice again, we have Heritage Level 2 honors because Heritage Level 2 course is considered to be equivalent of a Level 3 course, so Level 3 and above is inherently honors, so it is inherently honors. However, Heritage Level 1 also gets that note about the Level 1 course is offered as standard and can only be offered as standard right now, but it may be available as honors pending final approval. And that's true for all of our languages. So I just wanted to emphasize what that asterisk is and the fact that we're still working on the details about that becoming the reality, as being able to offer level 1 heritage as both standard and honors options. Likewise, you see this. I told you American Sign Language sometimes gets broken out on its own. And that's because we want to make sure we address the particular and unique skills of an ASL program. Notice that again, we've got our different standards at the top, interpretive, interpersonal, and presentational. But now, instead of what we saw for spoken languages, those skills like interpretive communication is broken down into receptive communication, particularly finger spelling. Interpersonal is called interactive in an ASL course. And then presentational communication is called expressive. And again, we have an option because there is a written component of ASL. It's called glossing. And so that you see that it's in sort of the writing column, if you will, for where spoken languages would have it. But it, like with the classical languages, is just optional. So it's included for those ASL programs locally that choose to have a written component and want to teach glossing to their students, particularly because maybe they're training students to be interpreters. So a lot of interpreters use glossing as part of their work. And I see we have an ASL teacher in the house who's commenting on their programs in their language and how amazing they are. And like I said, ASL is the fastest growing language in the state right now. It has made huge strides in the last 10 years. And it's well on its way to becoming one of our more common languages. It's actually in our last set of data that was released, the number 5 language in the state as far as enrollment goes statewide. So we have Spanish, French, Chinese, Latin, and ASL is number 5 currently. So there you see, though, for ASL Heritage Level 1 and ASL Heritage Level 2, what their proficiency outcomes are. A couple things to note, and there's actually 2 sets of asterisks here for ASL. The one is, of course, with the Level 1 course could be offered. I mean, it is offered as standard, may be available as honors pending final approval. And then also for our ASL community, we always put this note in that you see with the 2 asterisks. We talk about how ASL is our predominant language, most commonly used by the deaf community in the United States and Canada. And also in North Carolina, in 2007, our General Assembly passed legislation recognizing ASL as a modern language that fulfills things like the UNC system requirements for a foreign language. And it specifies that it's ASL that's the language and the culture that students are learning, as opposed to some of the other things you see listed there, like MCE or the Seeing Essential English SEE. So there's just some things that we distinguish there, and sometimes we are called on to quote the legislation that supports our ASL programs being modern languages, just like French and Chinese are. All right, so that's our dual and heritage language programs. Let's move on to our modern language programs. So these are pages 8 to 13. There's quite a bit here in this section, and it's sort of the longest one, which it is in our current standards too. Once again, we start out with a program description, what modern languages are, and specifically they are the study of languages that are currently used as the first language and or by a specific population for communication. For example, like ASL would be. And these are the ones that are most common because this is usually where language is taught as a separate subject, right? So just as before, we have our K-8 program details, and they're followed by proficiency outcome charts. There's kind of an explanation like you saw in classical languages about K-8 programs with FLES and FLEX and exploratory. Here are the proficiency outcomes charts for K-8 modern language programs. So up in the left-hand corner, you have the category 1 and 2 languages and their outcomes. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, you have the category 3 and 4 languages all listed again, and their outcomes. And so you can see, I think, with the color coding, how things change a little bit depending on which category of language we're talking about. Also notice we have included ASL in with the category 3 and 4 languages. As we said, we do sometimes, and then sometimes it's broken out with its own proficiency chart. So there you see where it's included for K-8 programs. All right, so there's a summary of the skills for our K-8 programs. And then we go on to our levels 1 through 8, because in modern languages, we have levels 1 through 8. And again, we have a description of that at the top, much like we have for the classical languages, levels 1 through 6. And then we have this chart, which is our category 1 and 2 languages for modern languages with the outcomes, again, with the standards at the top, and then the list of courses on the left-hand side so that you can see each skill area and how it's changing as far as the proficiency outcomes over time. One of the things the standards writing team hoped to do with rearranging the charts so that the standards are at the top and the courses are on the left is to make it more clear how the different skills look in a single course or program, and also maybe make it a little bit easier for teachers to read it, particularly with the proficiency summaries and thinking about how that looks in their courses and how that might look with the new objectives we have, and sort of the streamlined version of 3 standards and 2 strands rather than our current version, which was 4 standards and 3 strands. So, which we, of course, talked about in the first webinar we did in September. Just as before, our level 3 and higher are inherently honors, so that's, you always see that with the description of the language and, of course, the course code. But as before, levels 1 and 2, those are offered as standard only right now, but they may be available as honors as well, pending that final approval. So for those of you who teach levels 1 and 2, and I know I taught levels 1 and 2 French when I was in the classroom quite a number of times, think about, for example, how you would differentiate a course if you were doing a standard offering of let's say, a level 1 in your language versus an honors level offering with a different approach. You may already be familiar with the fact that those content areas that don't have inherently honors like we do with levels 3 and higher, there's actually an honors implementation guide and rubrics and so forth that teachers use as they develop courses to be offered at the honors level for students for those different courses that they're teaching. All right, so that's category 1 and 2 languages. Likewise, we have a similar kind of chart for category 3 and 4 languages, and we have those languages listed up there. We try to include as many languages as we could that would be the ones taught in North Carolina, as well as the ones that we know are in heritage language programs or possibly have been recognized by our Seal of Biliteracy, the Global Languages Endorsement. And so here you see how that changes over time with the different levels 1 through 8. And as always, there's a note that about those level 1 and 2 courses being standard only right now, but may be available as honors as well. And finally, American Sign Language again gets its own chart so that we can take a look at its very specific skills and think about glossing as an optional item. And you see that again here. And again, a reminder of not only the possibility of honors, ASL 1 and 2, but also, again, that legislation that supports ASL as a modern language in case we need that to share with anybody. So there's our preview. So I had asked you to do a take and tell. So which page, description, chart, or other bit of information did you decide you wanted to take from today? And you can start your answer by saying you're taking, and then whatever it is, just fill in the blank. And then who you're going to tell about your take from today. And I also want you to address, why did you choose that person or group to tell right away? So take a look at those 3 questions. Remember, you're typing your single message in the chat box, but you're not sending it yet until we say send it. I'll pause for a moment so you can answer your take and tell and let us know what caught your eye today, what page, description, chart, or anything else that you want to take from today and tell somebody about, and why. Let's pause for a moment and write our responses in the chat, but don't click send. Okay, let's watch the waterfall. All right, take a look at the chat. Look at all of the answers to this. Some of you have pointed out the same things. You're going to, for example, take like the same charts you want to share with somebody. Others have very specific items of what they want to take, even including page numbers. Nice, very detailed. All right. All right, and I can see. So a lot of you are commenting on this proficiency impact, the increased rigor, how that's going to look, the possibility that we might be able to offer levels 1 and 2 as both standard and honors. Remember, that hasn't been finalized yet, but we're hoping to get information about that soon to publish. A lot of people want to share information either with a particular group, like a local school board, or maybe with their PLC, other teachers who need to know this as they work together. I also see some questions about the possibility of offering honors levels 1 and 2. So we will talk a little bit more about that here in a minute. All right, well, thank you for all these answers. It looks like you've got some things you're taking back to tell. So I hope you enjoyed the take and tell instead of just show and tell. Remember, this is just draft 5, so this is not finalized yet, but you're welcome to use this as a guide to what our final document will look like. It'll be very similar. Very good. Well, I'm conscious of our time. I think we'll actually end on time today, so that's exciting. Please keep sharing your answers because people will want to read them, and I definitely want to read them and think about what we've learned together today and what else we need to talk about when it comes to our proficiency outcomes document. Yeah, we have a lot of people saying they're going to use these materials right now to think about resetting their proficiency goals. So great. Good deal. All right, well, let's wrap up today with some resources and some information that you can also take with you for the future as we learn more about our standards and the updates that have been made to them and when we'll start implementing them, which won't be until the fall of 2025. First and foremost, I want to remind everyone about the World Languages Resources Hub. This is where we put literally everything we have that you can use as tools for our state standards. We do also have our state standards, the new materials and so forth in here, but you may already have access to that on some of the DPI web pages too. I'm going to put a link into the chat for our World Languages Resources Hub. It's the one you see on the page there. If you use Canvas, you can actually bookmark this site on your Canvas dashboard just by hitting that join this course link. It is a public website, honestly, but you can put it on your Canvas dashboard so it's readily accessible. You see there are 4 categories of materials here. The first one is our World Language Standards Instructional Toolkit resources. The second one is our teacher and classroom resources. The third is our administrator and program resources. And finally, we have professional learning. So if you're able to get to the World Languages Resources Hub, know that one of the things you might want to look at first is the information on the World Language Standards. You see that we have information about the World Language, or the World Language Standards for Learning Languages, which is our national standards, if you will, but also other sets of standards that have been considered in our new standards, like the standards for classical languages and the standards for learning American Sign Language. All of those were considered as we looked at our overall structure of our new standards and being aligned to those 5 C's that all of those groups use. And then you can see their materials in the hub right away under our national standards button for the World Language Standards category. There's also additional information about proficiency if you want to look at that. And again, you want to learn maybe more about the novice low through advanced high. So there's a new proficiency outcomes spot as well, where we're posting all of that information for you to get to or to request on your own. So there's the actual proficiency guidelines, which were just updated and released in time for our draft 3 materials that the standards writing team was finishing up for us before approval. So they're published in 2024. But there's also things like the inverted pyramid posters that you've seen us use here, and other tools as well, like the successful actual can-do statements. that we can use as support in implementing our standards. So be sure and check out the World Languages Resources Hub. Also, know that, like I said, this is draft 5 of our proficiency outcomes document. So this is our handout today. Our standards resources team, which is made up of people from our DRC, the Data Review Committee, as well as the SWT, standards writing team. They also applied and said they wanted to continue their work together. So we have a small but mighty group. They're working to make additional updates to the proficiency outcomes document, or POD, as well as we're waiting on final approvals on course codes and other changes. And so some of the things I talked to you about today about honors level possibly being available, we are still waiting for final approvals. We hope to get that soon. Our goal is to have the proficiency outcomes document finished and published by the end of January in time for the regional workshops. I do see a quick question about sharing a link to this presentation or finding that someplace else. In fact, I will be sharing the slides from this presentation, the recording and everything. And we're going to talk about that here in just a moment about where you can find that when it's posted. Another thing I wanted to share with you is, and we've kind of hinted at, is in the World Languages Resources Hub, as we create our standards-based resources for this school year of installation, we are going to be posting those in the hub. And so we're particularly looking at the teacher and classroom resources that are getting updated for our new standards, as well as the administrator and program resources that are being updated. Things like the administrator guides and bridging documents are in the process of being updated. The COCOs that I mentioned before, the clarifying objectives by course outcomes, have been renamed as navigators. So when they get posted to our World Languages Resources Hub at the end of January, they'll have a new button that says navigators, and that's where you'll be able to find them. We'll also be releasing new course codes, like for our K-8 courses, and if we are approved for the honors level options for levels 1 and 2, there will be new course codes for that. Some of those are on things like the Navigators pages, where you can find the Navigator materials for different languages, but some of it's also going to be like in the master course code list if we get that final approval. We'll also have updated crosswalks, and we have a number of other documents that are coming. For example, there's going to be a glossary with our new standards, as well as the LIS defined for world language, or literacy instruction standards defined for world languages, which will have information about the literacy instruction standards that you're probably already familiar with, but using our objectives at different proficiency levels and examples of how that would look in the classroom. There will also be a parent and caregiver guide, and of course, unpacking documents available for our new standards. And some of those materials, like the glossary and the parent caregiver guide and the unpacking, are always materials, support materials that are created for new sets of standards. So science, of course, is now in initial implementation, so you might have seen the science glossary or the science parent and caregiver guide or a science unpacking document. So we'll have all those things too for world languages. Plus, like I said, some of the other materials we've developed over time that we know to be useful for advocacy and for curriculum writing and so forth, like administrator guides, the navigators, and so on. But everything will be in the World Languages Resources Hub. If you go there now, you'll see those materials for our current standards. But then we will be posting the new materials at the end of January. Here's where we are, by the way. I said we're in installation, so you see we're in the middle of the road. We've passed review and revision, and so our little car of how we're moving forward is in installation. We're spending this entire school year updating resources, doing things like the standards webinar series, making sure everyone is ready and understands the new standards, and they can start writing their local curriculum with our new standards. We will not begin implementing the new standards in our classrooms until the 25-26 school year, so the fall of 2025. But I always encourage you to get the World Languages Installation Timeline document. You see there on the screen, and I'm going to put in the chat the shortened URL that goes to it, but there's also a QR code if you like those. And I will pop that in the chat. Know that the World Languages Installation Timeline is actually a Canva document, meaning that it is a live document that continues to change. So if you go out to that, you will quickly see that there are links to things like register for this webinar and then webinars to come, and information gets added as we go through the year for things like the asynchronous option from our first webinar. So that's our timeline. Also, I wanted to share with you, I know you know about the standards webinar series, but I had hinted before that we are going to have some regional workshops, and here is the information that I'd like to share with you today about those. We will have standards implementation train the trainer regional workshop in a series in the spring, so late February through early April. You can see the dates in the different regions and when we will be there. So we're kind of starting in the east and working our way west. That's specifically because we know in those early months like February, it can still be a little snowy in the western part of our state. And so we're going to work our way across. Each regional workshop, when it takes place, will have two different sessions. Session 1 in the morning will be about all the new standards and all the support tools that have been created by the standards resources team and others to support implementation. Then session 2 in the afternoon, we'll take a sort of a deeper dive into the new standards, and we'll talk about planning and networking with folks who are on site that day at that regional workshop. Plus, we'll have an integration session with the LIS, the Literacy Instruction Standards. So take a look at that. Think about saving the dates, particularly if you're the person who gets to go to these workshops and be that trainer who brings it back to your school or district. Registration will be flexible but prioritized, meaning that you can sign up for session 1, session 2, or both sessions, depending on your schedule and your needs. However, it will be prioritized. So what we will be looking for is we will have seats available in each region for the educators in that region. And so if, for example, you are in one region but want to attend a different region's train the trainer workshop for some reason, we can put you on a wait list, and if there's spots, we can certainly let you drive to a different region to join that day to accommodate your schedule. But we will try to prioritize to get as many people trained in each of our 8 regions as we can. And by the way, if you've already looked at the standards installation timeline, you know that the registration for our regional workshop series will be coming out in December. Yeah, I see someone just put that in there. Can you email us the link to sign up for the regional workshops? Yes, I can. And it will actually be in our materials starting in December. So in our listserv newsletters, it will be there. On the installation timeline, it will be there. And in some of these other places I'm going to show you on the World Languages Resources Hub, you'll have information about registration, but starting in December. So we're about a month out before we see that yet. But do keep in mind these dates and save the date and share this information with others who may need to know as well. This is just a reminder about our Standards Update webinar series, which you're attending. We are now halfway through it. Notice that the overview of the new standards now has an asynchronous option. And my plan is that the slide deck, the recording, the handout, the links, and that asynchronous option for this broadcast will be posted on our World Languages Resources Hub under Professional Learning within the next 10 days. And so those of you who wanted to get the slides and that kind of thing, that's where you need to go to get that. Speaking of the World Languages Resources Hub, you can see that under Professional Learning, there's a space just for standards installation. And that's important because you can go there and get information about things like the Standards Update webinar series, the archives I just talked about, and the asynchronous option. And that's where we will be posting some of the materials for the Train the Trainer workshop series and the details about dates and locations and ultimately registration in December. All right. That's it. Let's do a quick wrap up. First and foremost, any other questions you have about the proficiency outcomes document for the new standards, please put them in the chat and let me know. Also wanted to remind you that I will submit your request for certificates of attendance within 10 days of the broadcast. So you should hopefully receive your certificates for attending today's broadcast as an email attachment by mid to late November. Look for them then. And finally, please submit the evaluation form today. You see that on the screen with a shortened URL, which I'm going to put in the chat. And you also see the QR code that you can use to access that. So please go ahead and jump in on that. Let me know what you learned, what was helpful or not to you in this broadcast today so that I can continue to improve as well. Okay, I see a couple other questions about the proficiency outcomes document. One person says, if the standard and honors options become available, if those get approved, how will we differentiate between the levels? Will there be guidance for that? And the answer is yes, there will be guidance, and we will be looking at, for example, the honors implementation guide and the rubrics that many other subject areas already use when they create an honors level offering of a standard level course that they also teach. We'll be using those same materials. Some of you, if you have colleagues who already do that or involved in that honors process, you may know that there are some honors vignettes, video vignettes that kind of show like an objective from that set of standards and how you would make it an honors level objective in a curriculum and give it more depth and things like that. And so I will be creating one of those for world languages once we get approval to do honors for levels 1 and 2. So look for that, as well as more information about that training that goes with the honors implementation guide and the rubrics to create honors level options for standard level courses. That's it. I thank you so much for joining me today. We've been a little over time, but not a lot. You can always reach out to me, by the way, via email, like it says on the screen. And this year, I've also got an option if you want it. I know everyone is very busy, but you're welcome to connect with me as NCDPI World Languages and schedule a one-on-one meeting. You can use that link in the chat or the QR code on the screen as well. To find a time where our schedules match up, where we can talk one-on-one. So if you want a deeper discussion about the proficiency outcomes document or our new standards or anything like that, see if you can find a time and let's chat about what you're interested in learning more on. Once again, I thank you for joining us today. This has been a great conversation. I hope you've learned something that you can take back. You do have your, take and tell that you've got to do as well. So I hope you're working on that and thinking about that already. And I am going to close out our recording and answer some final questions.